Is inflation higher than what they tell you? That's a good question. If you heard any number, percentage of inflation rate, chances are that this number is an indicator, which is called the CPI, Consumer Price Index, which is the most famous and most used indicator to calculate inflation. So to answer this question seriously, we have to understand what the CPI is and how it's calculated. Actually, the method that's used to calculate inflation. The most used, okay? And it is controversial. Why? Well, the main controversy is this. The CPI calculates inflation based on a basket of goods, okay? So they give you a basket of goods. Each of them has a different weight. So you do a weighted average of the variations of the price of those goods, right? So you take those, let's say, 5 goods that cost their amount of money today. They see them in 5 years, and they calculate the inflation in 5 years. Normally, inflation is actually calculated annually. The normal rate you hear is annual inflation. If you hear about monthly inflation, it means we are in an hyperinflation period. So the controversy is this. It's assumed that when prices rise, you don't just buy the same things. You try to lower your standards. And so this is an assumption that goes beyond the fact that you change your behavior, consumer behavior, so you buy different things or not, right? So what they do is they change the goods that are put in this basket of goods. They put lower quality goods, goods that have lower prices, so that actually inflation results in at a much lower rate. If you bought the same goods, so if you didn't adapt to the raising standards of living, you're actually living at a higher inflation rate than the one you see from the CPI. So the changing of the goods inside that basket is the first big controversy. A second controversy is that the CPI is based on the consumption that a citizen in urban areas have. And not rural areas. So this doesn't represent a part of the population. The third controversy, which is actually, I think, as important as the first, if not more, is that the CPI doesn't include the housing market. The CPI doesn't include rental properties. And that's relevant, okay, because houses are an important thing that people buy. There are many reasons why it's not considered as part of that basket. One of these is that buying a house is considered not a consumption event, but an investment event. And consumer price index, it's based on consumption, goods you consume. The second reason is you don't buy a house every month. Well, hopefully, but normally people don't buy houses in multiple times. You buy a house every 20 years. And which means that in some years you spend 0% of your income on rental properties, and once in 20 years you spend 10 times or 20 times your annual income. And a third reason why it's not considered, the inflation on rental properties is not considered in the CPI, is that the inflation on rental properties, on real estate, it's much higher than the one on goods, though it would have a relatively very important percentage on the total result of the CPI. It's a study that I saw on an article by The Economist that said that over a certain period of time, the inflation in developed countries was much higher on rental properties than it was on consumption goods. And the average OECD was the double. Inflation over that period of time on consumption good, so CPI calculated inflation was 3%, and rental properties inflation was 6%. So the exact double. So you see, this would have a big distortion on the result of the index. So it's important to remember that it's not there. So if you're interested in buying a house, the CPI might fool you a bit. But it makes sense it's not there. Another reason why it would be risky to put it there is that if inflation results higher than what the consumption of people actually is, that would push policymakers, especially monetary policies makers, to increase interest rates, and that can have bad impacts on investments. And lower investments, mean less jobs, less economic growth. So I hope, guys, this video made a little bit more clear the situation on the CPI, what's included, what's not, how it's calculated, how you should take it, because it makes sense if you change your behavior, if you don't buy a house, if you live in urban areas. But if you live in rural areas, you want to buy a house, you don't change your consumption behavior, consumption standards, the CPI is a totally distant thing for you. So it's relative to you. It depends on you. And I hope this helps.